So at the end of the class today, I will be sending out the recording along with the slideshow. And if there are any questions that come up that I can't answer or that aren't answered during the presentation, we can email Kevin afterwards and I will loop everybody in so we can get that answered. So I'll go ahead and get started. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the broker agency agreement. So this is going to be an agreement between the client and our brokerage in which you are represented. So at the very top, you're going to write the client's full name in the blank space and then Dalton Wade LLC in the second blank, followed by your name in the third blank. For term, in the first blank, you're going to write the start date of the agreement, and in the second date, you'll write the end date. If the buyer finds a property and a purchase contract is written, the buyer and the buyer's agent need to extend this agreement in writing. This agreement can be terminated at any time. The buyer's broker compensation, number 3. So if the clients decide to submit an offer on a property that you showed them, they will owe you compensation, and this agreement lays that out. So you're going to check all that apply. Option 1, you're going to fill in the blank with a flat fee dollar amount, which will be due at the time of closing. Option 2, you're going to fill in a percentage of the purchase price plus any other amount, which will be due at closing. Option 3, any other arrangement, which you can write out. So what's important here is you don't want to check multiple options. You're going to just check one of the options. So just one box should be checked. And it's also noted that compensation will be paid to the brokerage and not directly to the agent, and it will be due at closing. Compensation will be due for helping the buyer locate and purchase a property. And if the buyer defaults under their purchase contract, under no fault to the seller, there is a 30-day protection period upon this agreement's expiration. So the buyer would still owe compensation on a home purchase made on a house that was shown to the buyer during this agreement. And the buyer is authorizing their broker to receive compensation from the seller or the seller's broker if they are offering any, but the buyer's broker is prohibited from receiving compensation from any source other than what is listed in this agreement. Top of page 2, number 5 is the non-discrimination. So there must not be any discrimination in the sale or lease of property, and the buyers must initial that they understand. The buyer's duties, number 6. The buyer agrees to seriously consider the properties chosen by their agent, to respond promptly, to negotiate and act in good faith, to provide earnest money when needed, read all documents and disclosures carefully, comply with duties and deadlines, seek assistance from other professionals as needed, and to abide by all terms of this agreement. The broker is to assist the buyer in finding a property, presenting offers to purchase, negotiating terms as authorized by the buyer, and complying with all laws. The buyer must understand that the broker is not an expert in any specialized field, particularly in assessing the condition of a property. The brokers and agents are not lawyers and cannot give legal advice. So earnest money, number 9. If a purchase agreement is signed by all parties but doesn't close, a mutual release must be signed by everyone for earnest money to be released. And then number 10, you are going to check the box that applies. If your client does or doesn't give permission to share their identity to third parties. Number 11, this is a new add-on, that's why it's highlighted. So you must provide the buyer with the real estate brokerage services disclosure form. Number 12, the buyer must hold the broker harmless for any issues that arise that are not the broker's fault. Number 13, the buyer must understand that other buyers may submit offers on the property they choose, and other properties through the same firm, and they consent to this. Number 14, any claims arising from this agreement will go to mediation within 45 days of the issue. Within 60 days, if the issue is not solved, all claims will go to arbitration. And then this is the third page. So each party must understand and acknowledge they are waiving their rights to a trial by jury for all claims. This is a sole agreement between the parties, and if something is not written here, it has no effect. And then number 16, if there are any additional provisions, you would write it there. Please always just remember, we're not lawyers. We don't want to be just making up verbiage kind of out of the blue. Definitely check with Kevin, your broker, with our compliance team, if there's anything you're thinking of adding. And if you're unsure about anything, or if it's anything remotely complicated, it's always best to just consult an attorney. The bottom of the page is the signature and a signature section and contact information. All right, here is now the compensation agreement. So the compensation agreement has one of the things that is now mandatory to include on all sales. And it's coming out of the NAR settlement, the big NAR settlement from this year. And it's mandatory for all sales in which the listing side is offering the buying side compensation. Okay. So if you are a listing agent, it's good to have one of these filled out with your seller before you get any offers, because that way you've had the conversation with your seller. Do they want to offer compensation or not? And if you guys want to, the listing side and the buying side wants to negotiate something different than what you originally agreed upon, that's totally fine. But at least you have something signed initially, and you already have it in writing what your seller is at least willing to offer. All right, so compensation agreement. So the first two blanks, you're going to fill in the name of the buyer's brokerage and then the seller's brokerage. Then you're going to fill in the property description. So the first blank is the property address, and then the last two blanks, you're going to fill in the name of the seller and the name of the buyer. Number 2 is compensation. So if a transaction ensues, the seller's broker will pay the buyer's broker either a set dollar amount or a percent of the sales price. So fill in the blanks, whatever is agreed upon, whatever you prefer. There's also a third option for any other type of compensation agreement. So it leaves it really open. There's lots of options and ways that you could be, giving compensation, getting compensation. Number 3 is the term. So enter the agreement start and end dates. And then number 4, copies of this agreement must be given to all parties prior to closing. And miscellaneous. This agreement can be modified in writing. It is assigned to both parties, heirs, and their successors, and is governed by Alabama state laws. And then at the bottom, everybody needs to sign and fill out their information. And now we are getting into pages of the residential purchase contract. Up at the top is the party section. So the date line should be the same date on which this agreement is written. Then you're going to place the buyer's legal names as seen on their license on the buyer line. Please verify spelling if needed. The seller line should be the legal name of the person or persons or entity that owns the property. Their name should match the recorded deed. On the first line, write the name of the city where the property is located. Follow this with the county in which the property is situated, and then ensure that everybody understands, unless stated otherwise, all references to days are calendar days and not business days. Section 1 is the property description. So at least one of these 3 options need to be chosen. So you can either, you can choose multiple if needed, but Either option should be filled out in its entirety and not left blank. So don't abbreviate anything. The first box is the legal street address of the property. You should always put the MLS number and the property tax ID if that's known. The second box is the legal description. So legal description is the precise location and measurement of real property. It's a unique identifier and is often referenced during the title search to ensure no encumbrances are attached to the property. The third option is meters and bounds. So you must attach a description or a survey if you're using that option. Section 2 is the purchase price. So the purchase price is what the buyer is willing to pay, and that should go on the first line. A is earnest money. This section entails everything with the buyer's earnest money, if at all. The first line is the amount that the buyer is willing to put down. It would usually be between 1% and 5% of the purchase price. The buyer needs to check to where the earnest money is being delivered, as well as the date that it will be delivered by. It's typically due on the date that this agreement is signed. The parties will then release any liability should something happen if the earnest money is not delivered to the listing or selling broker. The earnest money should then be held onto until the agreement is signed by everybody, and then it will be delivered to the escrow agent. If the agreement is not signed, the earnest money will be sent back to the buyer. And an exception to this is cash earnest money, which is to be deposited immediately. If paying with a check, and the check bounces, or if the earnest money is not delivered on the date specified, the seller has the right to terminate the agreement. Default. This agreement states that if the buyer fails to carry out and perform the terms of the agreement, the earnest money mentioned will be given to the seller if both do not want to continue on. The buyer can still receive earnest money back in specific events or failures of the parties. A mutual release must be signed by both the seller and the buyers to that effect. So if it is undecided whether the buyer or the seller keeps the earnest money within 10 business days, the escrow agent who's holding the funds might file an interpleader action in court, and they are entitled to recover attorney's fees, costs, or other expenses associated with that. Financing. So this section B explains that the buyer will finance the purchase of the property. So in I, that should be checked if the buyer does not need to be approved for a loan. So if it's a cash purchase. And 2, if the buyer needs to acquire a loan, so just a conventional mortgage, any kind of mortgage, the buyer will select B2. And this section, they will then select which option they're using for their purchase. So that could be VA, FHA, assumption of mortgage. If the buyer is using a different loan from something that's listed here, you can write it on the other line. If known, the buyer should write their minimum loan to value percentage on the line there that's given. And this is the ratio of the value of the home that they want to buy, and then the loan you need to buy it. So it'd be shown as a percentage. Most lenders will use 80% as the threshold for a good loan to value ratio. Financing continued. So in the first blank at the top, one should write how many days the buyer will need to provide a pre-approval letter for any loan needed to secure the property. And in the event the buyer cannot obtain financing by the loan approval date, they only have 1 day to let the sellers know that they are still eligible to be returned earnest money. They must attach a denial letter from the lender. If the buyer doesn't try to obtain financing or does not provide to the seller a letter of pre-approval, they forfeit any earnest money to the seller. All right, lender required repairs. So if the lender is requiring that repairs be made, they need to be categorized and provided to the seller as soon as the buyer receives them from the lender. And a disclaimer is that the buyer and the seller acknowledge that pre-approval issued is not required by the listing or selling company or agents. Appraisals. So it needs to be selected if the buyer is or is not requiring an appraisal. If financing is used, the vast majority of lenders will require an appraisal on the property. It doesn't guarantee the value or condition of the property, but it will determine the maximum mortgage amount to be lent by the lender. So the buyer will not be obligated to continue the agreement and will not be subject to penalties by forfeiture if the property does not appraise for the purchase price or higher. So the next line states that within, fill in the blank, usually it's 5 days, the seller and the buyer will agree on a mutually acceptable resolution after receipt of the appraisal. If not, the agreement is then deemed canceled and the buyer will receive their earnest money back. Expenses. So this section explains that the buyer is required to pay all closing costs, expenses, fees, etc. with the financing. An exception is when the buyer is using an FHA or VA financing, where the seller will pay all costs associated that the buyer cannot pay. If the seller is going to contribute to closing costs, one should select the box and then write in the amount of money that the seller will use towards closing. Prorated expenses. So any ad valorem taxes, association fees or dues, additional fees or dues, rents from existing tenants, existing leases, everything that will be transferred to the buyer at closing. Taxes are prorated based on the tax assessor's office on the date of closing, unless agreed otherwise. Any increase or decrease in taxes will be the buyer's responsibility when the taxes are due. Closing agent or attorney. The buyer and the seller must decide whether they will split the costs of a closing agent or attorney, especially if there's a mortgage involved. They're aware that sharing these fees might create a conflict of interest for the attorney, who may ask for a signed affidavit to confirm that everyone understands this. Everybody also has right to have separate legal representation, but they must pay for that themselves. If they agree to share the fees, they should specify the chosen closing agent or attorney. If not, the buyer will choose and cover these costs, except as noted in paragraph 17. Section 3, closing and possession. This section has to do with the closing. So the first blank space should be the date and the buyer wants to close, the date the buyer wants to close. And then the second blank will be the number of days that the seller can perfect the title or cure any defects that are found. So the majority of the time, possession of the property is given at closing. But if not, you can write the date and the time in the remaining file on the pages here. If possession of the property and the delivery of the deed are different, it's recommended to enter into a written occupancy agreement. All funds from both buyer and seller are due at closing. Section 4 is agency disclosure. So this section is for those who are listing and selling the property. The listing company would be the company that is listing the property, and then the selling company would be Dalton Wade. On the next line down, only 2 blocks may be checked. The majority of the transactions will have the listing company on the left side checked as an agent of the seller, and then the selling company on the right side as an agent of the buyer. You must choose the correct option for your transaction. And then section 5 is the survey. So to begin, the buyer must choose if they would like a property survey completed by a registered Alabama land surveyor or not. Most lenders will require this if the buyer is getting financing. If the buyer requests a survey, the purchase agreement is contingent on receiving a survey from the date listed later. You can choose who will be responsible for paying for it. Either side can pay. If the seller pays for the survey, they can either write that the cost is included or not included in the seller's contribution. And then you need to write out when the survey will be delivered to the buyer. So it'll be no later than blank days before closing. And if the buyer would like a survey and fails to receive it and doesn't notify the seller, the survey contingency is forfeited. Section 6 is conveyance. This part says that the seller will use a specific type of deed to transfer the property to the buyer. It talks about clearing any legal issues with the property and how the title or ownership will be held. The agreement mentions that the property might have certain rights or restrictions, and it's important for the buyer to check the property's zoning. If the seller owns the property with someone else, they need to decide if they want to keep that ownership style even after selling. Section 7 is merchantable title. The seller promises to give the buyer a clear and legally sound title to the property, free of any issues unless specified in the agreement. If there are major problems with the title that can't be fixed within the agreed upon time, the buyer gets their earnest money back. The title will be guaranteed through one of these options: the owner's title insurance, mortgage title insurance, a title opinion, or a title abstract. The cost of this guarantee will be covered by either the buyer or the seller, as indicated in the agreement. If the seller pays, it may or may not be part of what they contribute overall. Section 8 is home warranty. So the buyer should choose if they require one, and it would be a 1-year home warranty policy at closing. So the next two boxes are going to be which party is paying for the home warranty. So either the buyer or the seller, and you're going to fill in the blank for whatever it will not cost more than. And then if the seller is paying for it, that can also be included in the seller's contribution. Inspection and disclosures, section 9. So it is the buyer's responsibility to determine the condition of the property. The buyer understands that the professional inspection services and contractors may be used for this purpose. The buyer understands that real estate licensees do not have the expertise to comment on the condition of a property, and they should not rely on what is said by the real estate agent regarding the condition of the property. A final inspection is allowed by the buyer prior to closing to ensure the property has not changed since the agreement. If anything has changed, the buyer must give written notice to the seller, and the seller will repair the material changes. At closing, the conditions of the property fall on the buyer, and it is then their responsibility. So section 9A, without or with inspection. So the buyer should choose one of the two options. If they plan to forego an inspection and take the property as is, they should check the first box. If the buyer requires an inspection on the home, they should check box 2. So this states that within a specified time period of the agreement being accepted, the buyer at their expense can inspect the property. It continues to state that the seller should leave all utilities on during this time. And if they are not, the seller will pay any reinspection fee up to a specific amount, which you can fill that in. During this time, the buyer can submit to the seller a list of requested repairs for the seller to make on the property. If this list is not given during the time frame, then the buyer will be waiving the right to an inspection and will continue to buy the property in as-is condition. During the inspection period, the buyer can cancel the agreement and get their earnest money returned if they inform the seller in writing that their inspection is unsatisfactory. So just a side note, this is a place in the contract where your buyer can get out of it if they are looking for a way, okay? So the next portion of this section starts with how many days the seller has to respond to the buyer's list of requested repairs, along with an extension if needed. If the seller fails to respond, it is considered that as agreed upon in writing by the seller and the buyer as it's not to exceed a reasonable amount. So if the cost of repairs exceeds, a certain threshold, the buyer has several options. They can choose to pay the excess amount, accept the property with minimal or no repairs, subject to approval, obviously, from the lender, or agree to a reduction in the purchase price so that the buyer can repair things later when they own it. They may also opt to cancel the agreement. So you can fill in the blank for, within how many days, as long as the cancellation is done in writing from the moment the seller informs them of their decision not to cover the repair costs. And if the buyer doesn't cancel during this time frame, if they've let the time period lapse, they have to continue on with the contract. So there is a radon inspection option that the buyer can choose, and as well as the sewer septic system, and then the termite or a wood infestation fungus report. So if that is a concern, the buyer can certainly get those and add those into the contingency section. All right. And then lead-based paint. So we don't want to forget about that. That's a super important one. The lead-based paint is going to apply to properties built before 1978. If that is the property that your client is interested in, you will need to have a lead-based paint disclosure. Both the buyer and sellers have to sign it. There is also a pamphlet that must be delivered. This is a very important one. Section 10 disclaimer. So this section states that both the seller and buyer acknowledge and agree that the people named will not be responsible or held liable for obligations that they have to have one there's no obligations between one another. Sorry, I don't know why that was written that way. But parties are going to agree to discharge and release all of the names from any claims, demands, damages, actions, causes of action or lawsuits that arise from the sale of the property. So this includes the condition of the heating, cooling, plumbing, etc., existence of asbestos, size or area of the property, all of that. There's a big list. So the last sentence just states that if this is a concern, the parties should obtain independent advice relative to whatever the concern is. So you're going to have an inspector come in and give an educated opinion on professional opinion. Section 11 is the seller's disclaimer. So the seller guarantees that they haven't been notified by any authority about outstanding assessments, public improvements, or unresolved issues with the property. They confirm that there's no unpaid debt on the property, except as outlined in the agreement. These guarantees stay valid even after the deed is transferred. However, neither the seller or any agent guarantees the condition of the property, except as specifically mentioned here. The property is being sold as is, and that means there are no additional warranties. And it's up to the buyer or someone they choose, an inspector, to thoroughly check and understand the property's condition, including its systems, heating, cooling, plumbing, etc., any structural aspects that are of concern, flood zone status, before they decide to buy. So inspection period is super, super important. Section 12 is fire, smoke, or gas detectors. So the buyer is responsible for ensuring that all necessary detectors and equipment meet the requirements of all the laws. This includes verifying that everything is in place, functioning correctly. After closing or possession, the buyer is solely responsible for maintaining the compliance with all of the laws. Section 13 is risk of loss, insurability of property. So the seller agrees to maintain sufficient hazard insurance on the property until the sale closes and the deed is transferred. If the property is damaged or destroyed, and the seller can't resolve it, the buyer can choose to cancel the agreement and get their earnest money back, or accept the property in its damaged state. If the buyer accepts the damaged property and there's any insurance payments that will be due to the seller, it will go toward the purchase price or be paid directly to the buyer. Section 14, other offers while the buyer's offer is pending. So before this agreement takes effect, the seller has the right to reject the buyer's offer or to counteroffer and accept another offer from a different buyer. They can also withdraw any previous offers they made to the buyer regarding the property. This means that while the buyer's offer is still being considered, the seller is not obligated to accept it and they can entertain other offers. Section 15. The purchase price includes all the structures, permanent fixtures on the property, such as ceiling fans, light fixtures, blinds, security systems, appliances, and more. It covers things like fences, trees, shrubs, permanent installations, unless they are specifically excluded in this agreement. Any personal items that are left on the property after closing are included at no cost to the buyer and do not increase the property's value unless agreed upon in writing otherwise. Section 16. After closing, information can be shared with your local board. Insert the board you are a part of in the blank. Section 17 is any additional provisions. So anything that's additional, can be put here, but please remember that in general, that's why addendas exist. So addendas exist to help amend or add on something to the purchase contract. So please use your addendas. I think most things can be covered by the use of addendas, but if not, or if you have questions, please reach out to Susan in compliance, our support team, or Kevin directly. Section 18, both parties acknowledge that if this agreement is canceled, or it doesn't close, any reason, any fees or costs paid upfront might not be refunded. So that needs to be acknowledged. Any services that were provided but are not yet paid for are the responsibility of the party who requested the services. Section 19 is mediation and arbitration. So if both buyers and sellers agree by initialing, any disputes will first go to mediation with a chosen mediator. If the mediation doesn't work within 60 days, disputes will then move to binding arbitration in Alabama. Both parties waive the right to a jury trial. The losing side pays for arbitration costs, and the arbitrator's decision is final and enforceable by law. Section 20. This agreement is the complete agreement between the parties regarding the property, replacing any previous agreements, whether they're oral or written. Nothing that is written outside of here will bind the buyer, seller, listing company, or selling company. And so important thing to note here is this is why it's important to make sure the addendas are included and are signed properly, because if something is missing on the addenda or it hasn't officially been included, it is not applicable to the transaction. Section 21, severability and headings. If any part of this agreement is found to be unlawful or unenforceable, it will be removed, but the rest of the agreement will still apply, unless removing that part, or if it becomes unfair to either party. So just because you remove one part or if one thing is not applicable, the rest of the agreement still stands. Section 22, this agreement can be signed and delivered by fax, and it will be valid and binding once the other party receives the fully executed contract. Section 23, force majeure. So this refers to just an unforeseeable circumstance, usually a natural disaster, something like that, in which one or both sides are not able to fulfill their obligations. So if the governor of Alabama declares a state of emergency for the state or county where the property is located during this agreement, deadlines will be extended by a specified number of days. Usually it's 14, and it will be 14 if nothing is written in the blank. This provision doesn't prevent the parties from agreeing to new deadlines or canceling the agreement, but any changes must be in writing. Section 24, the seller and buyer agrees that this agreement is not assignable. If it is assignable and in line with Alabama law, the buyer does or does not plan to make their rights under the agreement. If the buyer plans to market their rights, they agree to inform the seller in writing at least 2 days before the assignment. Section 25. So this offer expires at, insert the time period, on blank date, or if the buyer withdraws it in writing before then. Then we have both sides need to sign and date. And continuing on, we have the agreement acceptance date. And if there is a rejection with no counteroffer, the seller does need to sign. And if they are countering, they need to attach the counteroffer and check the box right here. And then at the very bottom, we have the real estate information, real estate office information, which you can easily find on your MLS. And that is all I have for you today. So I'm gonna just stop recording and just see if anybody has any questions.